Silence is often praised as wisdom. In a world overflowing with noise, opinions, and instant reactions, silence can look like strength. It can look like control. It can look like peace. But on that quiet evening inside a softly lit room high above a restless city, silence did not feel like any of those things. It felt heavy. It felt unfinished. It felt like something fragile was breaking without making a sound. The windows reflected the glow of distant streets, headlights sliding like slow rivers through the dark, but inside nothing moved. Keanu Reeves stood near the glass, his posture calm, his hands still, his gaze resting somewhere beyond the skyline as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Across from him, Sandra Bullock sat with her fingers interlaced in her lap, her shoulders drawn slightly inward, her eyes lifting toward him again and again before lowering, as though each attempt to speak dissolved before reaching her lips. The cameras were gone. The applause had long faded. There were no interviews waiting, no scripts to follow, no public roles to perform. There was only the quiet space between two people who had once understood each other without effort, and who now felt divided by a distance neither of them knew how to cross. Sandra had faced criticism before. She had lived through headlines that twisted moments into narratives, through seasons when public opinion rose and fell like unpredictable weather. None of that was new. What was new was this feeling, this unfamiliar weight in her chest that did not come from outside voices, but from the absence of one that mattered. She had always believed that real connection meant honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. She believed that respect meant speaking when something was wrong, naming what hurt, refusing to let confusion quietly rot into resentment. And yet here she was, surrounded not by anger, not by accusation, but by a calm silence that felt colder than any argument ever could. She watched Keanu's reflection in the glass, the way his face remained composed, almost gentle, and wondered how something so still could feel so distant. The words she had rehearsed in her mind hovered at the edge of her awareness, but none of them seemed capable of filling the space that had opened between them. The misunderstanding had not begun with drama. There had been no confrontation, no raised voices, no sudden betrayal. It had started the way so many painful things do in modern life, quietly, almost invisibly in the margins of public noise. A charity event, a brief interview, a simple question about resilience, about how people survive pressure, about what it means to stand firm in a world that constantly demands performance. Sandra had answered honestly, speaking about how some people endure by staying rooted, while others endure by walking away from what no longer aligns with them. She had spoken from experience, from reflection, from the countless conversations she had shared over the years about boundaries, humility, and self-respect. She had not mentioned names. She had not intended interpretation. But by the time her words traveled through headlines, edits, and endless online commentary, they had become something sharper, something narrower, something that pointed without ever explicitly saying so. And somehow, impossibly, they landed between her and Keanu like a blade neither of them had seen coming. Keanu had watched the clip alone. He had seen not just the words, but the reactions, the assumptions layered onto them by people who did not know either of them, who did not understand the history behind their quiet conversations, their shared respect for privacy, their mutual belief that kindness did not need an audience. He did what he had always done when the world became loud. He stepped inward. He did not respond publicly. He did not defend himself. He did not call immediately. Silence had long been his way of staying grounded, of refusing to let chaos dictate his inner life. To many, that silence looked noble. It fit the image people had built around him, the idea of a man too thoughtful to be pulled into noise, too centered to be shaken by misinterpretation. But inside him, something had tightened. Not anger, not resentment, something quieter. A sense of being misunderstood not by the public, but by someone whose understanding had always mattered. When Sandra finally reached out, her message was light at first, almost casual, an attempt to brush aside what she believed was an obvious distortion. But the reply did not come. She waited an hour, then another, then a day. She told herself he was busy. She told herself silence had always been part of who he was, but with each passing stretch of unanswered time, the meaning of that silence began to change. It no longer felt neutral. It no longer felt like space. It began to feel like a decision she had not been invited into. And that feeling unsettled her more than any rumor ever could. Because rumors belonged to strangers. This did not. This belonged to someone she had trusted with her unguarded thoughts, her doubts, her hopes about how to live gently in a demanding world. Days passed. The world moved as it always does. Meetings, commitments, casual conversations that required smiles and presence. Sandra fulfilled them all, But beneath the surface, her thoughts kept circling the same quiet question. Not what did I say wrong, but what does his silence mean? She replayed old memories, long talks about loss, about the strange loneliness that fame can create even in crowded rooms, about the responsibility that comes with having influence and choosing not to misuse it. She remembered him once saying that humility wasn't about thinking less of yourself, but about thinking of others more. That memory echoed now with an unexpected ache. Because in this moment, it felt as though she had been left alone with her uncertainty, forced to interpret quiet where clarity once lived. And uncertainty, she was learning, can become its own kind of wound. Keanu, meanwhile, told himself he was doing what he had always done, protecting space, refusing to react before understanding settled. His life had taught him that words once released could not be taken back, and that speaking too quickly often fed misunderstandings rather than resolving them. He believed patience revealed truth. He believed restraint prevented harm. Yet as the days stretched on, he began to feel the cost of that belief. He noticed the absence where connection had been. He noticed how often his mind drifted toward the unspoken. He told himself he was waiting for clarity, but he could not ignore the quiet realization forming beneath that justification. That waiting also protected him. It protected him from vulnerability, from the risk of saying the wrong thing, from the discomfort of naming a feeling he did not yet fully understand. What neither of them could see yet was that they were not standing on opposite sides of a conflict born from ego or betrayal. They were standing inside a collision of values. Sandra believed resilience meant engagement, that care required presence, that honesty, even when painful, was a form of respect. Keanu believed resilience meant endurance, that care sometimes required restraint, that silence could be an ethical choice in a world addicted to reaction. Both believed in kindness. Both believed in humility. Both believed in protecting what was real from what was performative. And yet those shared beliefs were now expressing themselves in opposite ways, stretching the space between them not through cruelty, but through difference. The public, as always, sensed something before it was ever spoken. Subtle shifts were noticed, interactions that did not happen, glances that were missing from rooms they once shared easily. Speculation bloomed, careless and constant, turning absence into narrative, quiet into entertainment. Sandra felt the exposure not because of what people said, but because of what they could not see. They did not see the moment she stared at her phone, then turned it face down as if that might quiet the hope she did not want to admit. They did not see the drafts of messages she never sent, each one sounding either too defensive or too vulnerable. They did not see how silence, when chosen by someone you care about, can make you question not only the situation, but yourself. The turning point of this first chapter did not arrive with confrontation. It arrived with awareness. Sandra attended a small gathering honoring community volunteers, far from cameras, far from headlines. Ordinary people spoke about extraordinary endurance, about being overlooked, about giving without recognition, about the quiet hurt that comes not from cruelty but from invisibility. One woman spoke about a relationship that had ended not with anger but with silence, and she said something that settled deeply into Sandra's chest. She said that rejection hurts, but silence hurts differently because rejection acknowledges your existence while silence makes you question your worth. Sandra felt the truth of those words immediately, not as accusation, as clarity. For the first time, she stopped waiting for Keanu's silence to resolve itself and began recognizing what it had already done inside her. That night, she did not write a message meant to persuade or correct. She wrote a letter meant to tell the truth. She wrote about how the silence had made her feel unseen, about how kindness without communication could still wound, about how she respected his need for quiet but needed him to understand the cost of it. She did not blame. She did not demand. She simply named her experience, trusting that honesty offered without hostility still carried dignity. When she sealed the envelope, she felt no certainty about what would follow, only a quiet sense of alignment. She had chosen to honor her values, even if the outcome remained unknown. Unaware of her decision, Keanu stood at his own unmarked crossroads. He felt the growing tension between who he had always been and what this moment might be asking of him. He sensed, though he could not yet articulate it, that silence, once a refuge, was slowly becoming a wall. And walls, no matter how calmly built, eventually separate what they were meant to protect. Part 1 closes not with answers, but with two people standing in different rooms, guided by the same values, yet separated by how those values were being lived. The question now is no longer about misunderstanding. It is about whether humility will make room for conversation, and whether silence will remain a shelter or finally give way to truth. The days following Sandra's letter did not arrive with clarity or relief. They arrived quietly, one after another, each carrying the same unanswered weight. Morning light filtered through her windows, gentle and indifferent, illuminating a world that had not changed even though something inside her had. She continued to move through her routines with practiced grace, attending meetings, answering questions, offering smiles where they were expected. Yet beneath every interaction lived a steady exhaustion that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with holding emotions that had nowhere to go. Waiting, she was discovering, was not a passive state. It demanded energy. It demanded restraint. It demanded a constant negotiation between hope and self-respect. And as the hours accumulated, waiting began to feel less like patience and more like a choice she was making again and again, each time quietly asking herself whether endurance was still an expression of strength or slowly becoming an abandonment of her own emotional needs. Silence had changed shape. It was no longer only confusion. It had become presence. It sat with her at night when the city's noise softened and there were no distractions left to borrow from. It lingered in the small pauses between conversations, in the moments when her attention drifted and inevitably returned to the same unspoken questions. She found herself reflecting not only on Keanu, but on herself, on how often she had believed that clarity was something others owed her, rather than something she also had the right to claim. She began to see that her hurt was not rooted in rejection, but in invisibility. What wounded her was not the possibility that he disagreed, but the absence of any acknowledgement that her voice still reached him at all. And invisibility, she realized, was a subtle ache. It did not announce itself. It accumulated. Keanu carried his own version of that accumulation. The unopened letter traveled with him, sometimes physically, always mentally. It rested in the quiet places of his awareness, not as an obligation, but as an invitation he had not yet accepted. Each day he told himself he would read it when he felt more settled, when he could approach it without emotion clouding understanding. But each day he also recognized the subtle truth beneath that reasoning. He was postponing vulnerability. He was delaying a moment that might require him to step beyond the shelter silence had always provided. His life had taught him that quiet could be a refuge, a way to protect what was sacred from being distorted. Yet lately, he felt the refuge turning inward, less like a space of reflection and more like a room with no windows. He noticed it in small ways, in the way conversations felt slightly thinner, in how often he paused before speaking even about simple things, as though measuring words so carefully that their meaning began to dissolve before leaving him. What troubled him most was not the possibility that Sandra was hurt. It was the realization that he had not allowed himself to witness that hurt. He had assumed patience was kindness. He had assumed restraint was respect, and in many contexts, those assumptions had served him well. But now, he could not ignore the growing sense that silence maintained without explanation might carry its own form of harm. He began to see how easily virtue could become habit, and how habits, once detached from awareness, could drift away from their original purpose. Silence chosen intentionally could be an act of care. Silence maintained automatically could become neglect without malice. This distinction unsettled him because it challenged the very foundation of how he had learned to move through conflict. Sandra's inner world was shifting in a different direction. The absence of response had stripped away the comfort of expectation, forcing her into a clarity she could not have reached otherwise. She began to see that she had been waiting not only for Keanu's words, but for permission to feel resolved, and that realization was both painful and freeing. She had built much of her understanding of resilience around engagement, around the courage to confront, to articulate, to process emotion through dialogue. But now she was encountering another form of resilience, one that did not rely on outcome, one that asked her to ground herself regardless of whether someone else met her halfway. She started to redirect her energy, not toward the question of when he would speak, but toward the quieter, more difficult work of stabilizing her own sense of worth independent of response. This did not remove the ache. It changed its tone. The hurt no longer asked for immediate resolution. It asked for self-respect. As public curiosity continued its restless movement, both of them withdrew slightly, not out of fear, but out of an unspoken need for internal space. Their separation was not dramatic. There were no harsh words to revisit, no definitive ending to mourn. That absence made it more complex. Without clear conflict, there was nothing to argue against, nothing to repair directly. Only a slow erosion of ease, a subtle shift in energy that those closest to them began to notice. Conversations became more cautious. Laughter came, but it did not linger as it once had. It became clear that unresolved emotion rarely remains private. It alters the way we show up everywhere. Sandra noticed it in herself, in how often she felt emotionally guarded even in safe spaces. Keanu noticed it in how often he felt distant even in conversations meant to be present. Silence, once a personal choice, had begun to ripple outward. The moment that quietly changed something inside Keanu arrived unexpectedly, in a place far removed from public narratives or personal history. He found himself in conversation with someone who had no knowledge of his life beyond that moment. There was no recognition, no performance, only an ordinary exchange that drifted toward vulnerability as so many human conversations eventually do. The person spoke about a relationship that had ended not with argument, but with waiting. They spoke about unanswered messages, about the way silence can invite imagination to fill the gaps, often with stories far harsher than reality. They said something simply without emphasis, without knowing its weight. They said that silence teaches people to write their own conclusions, and those conclusions rarely favor hope. Keanu listened as he always did, but this time the words stayed. They did not pass through him as observations. They settled. They echoed. That night he opened the letter, not quickly, not defensively. He read it slowly, allowing each sentence to register not as a claim, but as an experience being offered. Sandra did not accuse. She did not frame him as wrong. She described what silence had felt like from where she stood. She spoke about invisibility, about the way unacknowledged quiet can slowly dismantle trust, about how respect to her meant being trusted with the truth, even when that truth was complicated. As he read, something in him softened, not into guilt, but into recognition. He recognized not an enemy, but a mirror. He saw reflected back the unintended consequence of his own coping. For the first time, he fully allowed himself to consider that in protecting himself from misinterpretation, he may have inadvertently allowed misunderstanding to take root where clarity could have lived. Sandra, unaware that the letter had been read, reached a quiet turning point of her own. She began to accept that she might never receive the response she once imagined, and that this possibility did not need to diminish her. She focused on reclaiming her emotional agency, on building a sense of steadiness that did not depend on external confirmation. She spent more time in environments that reminded her of connection in its simplest forms, conversations unburdened by history, moments of shared humanity that asked nothing beyond presence. She found comfort not in distraction, but in alignment, in the knowledge that she had expressed herself honestly and respectfully. Whatever followed, she would not carry the regret of having remained silent out of fear. As part 2 draws to a close, both stand inside different expressions of the same realization. Silence and speech are not moral opposites. They are tools, and like all tools, their meaning depends on how and when they are used. The distance between Keanu and Sandra is no longer sustained only by emotion, but by philosophy, by deeply held beliefs about what strength looks like and how care is best expressed. Yet within that distance lives the potential for something more than repair. It holds the possibility of transformation, because conflict born from shared values, rather than selfish intent, carries within it the capacity to refine those values rather than destroy them. The question that now hovers between them is no longer whether silence caused harm. It is whether humility will be strong enough to bridge what silence has stretched apart, and whether the courage to engage can meet the wisdom of restraint without either losing its meaning. There comes a moment in every unresolved conflict when silence stops feeling neutral and begins to feel like a decision. For Keanu, that moment arrived not through drama, not through pressure from the outside world, but through a quiet heaviness that followed him everywhere he went. The letter had been read, but its words did not fade. They moved with him, settling into his thoughts during long pauses, surfacing unexpectedly in ordinary moments, reshaping the way he heard conversations around him. He began to notice how often he measured words before offering them, not out of wisdom, but out of fear of misalignment. He had always believed that caution preserved meaning. Now he began to see how excessive caution could erode it. In trying so carefully not to cause harm, he had created a space where harm could grow unnoticed. That realization did not strike him with shame, but with responsibility. Responsibility to examine not only what he intended, but what his choices produced. Sandra's internal world had been evolving in parallel, shaped not by answers, but by the absence of them. The waiting had stripped her emotional life down to its essentials, revealing truths she could no longer avoid. She understood now that her pain had never truly been about the interview or the misunderstanding that followed. It had been about recognition, about whether her presence in someone's life still carried enough weight to be met with honesty. The silence had not made her angry. It had made her reflective. It had invited doubt, and then forced her to confront that doubt without someone else's voice to soften it. In doing so, it had also shown her a quiet strength she had not fully claimed before, the ability to remain grounded even when emotional certainty was removed. She no longer waited with the same restless hope. She waited with awareness, knowing that whatever came next would be something she met standing, not leaning. Their eventual meeting did not arrive wrapped in symbolism or orchestrated timing. It emerged through circumstance, understated and unavoidable, a reminder that real life rarely arranges emotional turning points with ceremony. They found themselves in the same room for reasons unrelated to their history, in a neutral space where neither could retreat without acknowledging the other's presence. When their eyes met, there was no rush of relief, no visible tension, no visible warmth either. There was recognition. The kind that carries memory, complexity, and something fragile that has not yet been defined. The air between them felt different, charged not with conflict, but with the accumulated weight of what had not been spoken. It was not uncomfortable in the way arguments are uncomfortable. It was heavy in the way meaning is heavy when it has waited too long to be expressed. Keanu spoke first, not because he had planned the moment, but because he could no longer ignore what restraint was asking of him. His voice was calm, but it carried something new, an openness he rarely allowed himself to bring forward without certainty. He did not begin by defending his silence. He did not explain headlines or misunderstandings. He spoke about himself, about how he had learned to survive noise by withdrawing from it, about how he had come to associate quiet with respect, patience with care, restraint with wisdom. He acknowledged that in many parts of his life, that approach had protected what was real from being distorted. But he also admitted that in this situation, he had relied on that instinct without examining its impact. He said that he had believed waiting would create clarity, but that in waiting, he had not considered what the absence of communication might create on the other side. His words were not polished. They were not statements meant to close a narrative. They were reflections offered without armor. Sandra listened without interruption, not out of politeness, but because something in his tone signaled sincerity. She recognized that what he was offering was not an explanation meant to resolve, but an interior truth meant to be understood. When she responded, her voice was steady, shaped by the clarity she had earned through weeks of reflection rather than reaction. She spoke about what silence had felt like where she stood, about how the absence of response had invited her to write stories in the quiet, and how those stories, no matter how compassionate she tried to make them, inevitably carried doubt. She spoke about how respect to her had always meant being trusted with complexity, being allowed into the emotional process rather than only its outcome. She did not frame him as wrong. She framed the space between them as real. She named its effect, and in doing so, she reclaimed her own experience without diminishing his. The exchange did not resolve everything. It was not meant to. It shifted something more foundational. For the first time since the misunderstanding had begun, silence no longer dominated the room. It stepped aside. In its place stood mutual recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that both of them had been acting from values they sincerely held, and that those values had collided rather than aligned. They did not apologize excessively. They did not search for a verdict. They acknowledged impact. They acknowledged intention. And in that balanced space, something fragile but essential was restored, the ability to see one another clearly again, not as symbols of calm or strength, but as people navigating imperfect choices. They parted not with closeness, but with intention. The distance that followed was no longer imposed. It was chosen not as avoidance, but as respect for the work that still needed to happen internally. Both understood that healing did not require constant proximity, but it did require transparency. Keanu left with a deeper awareness that humility was not only about restraint, but about responsiveness, about knowing when silence served reflection and when it obstructed connection. Sandra left with an expanded understanding that not every quiet moment was abandonment, and that patience, when paired with communication, could coexist with resilience rather than oppose it. As the world outside continued its restless movement, something quieter and more consequential was unfolding beneath the surface. Two people were learning that shared values do not guarantee shared understanding, and that kindness must be expressed in ways that can be received, not only in ways that feel true to the giver. Their conflict had stripped away assumptions and left behind a clearer view of one another, imperfect, thoughtful, and still capable of growth. By the end of Part 3, the story shifts from pain to possibility. The tension remains, but it has changed shape. It no longer threatens to sever what exists. It challenges it to evolve. The question that now stands is no longer whether silence hurt, but whether understanding can transform what silence once damaged. and whether compassion, when practiced actively rather than quietly, can become the bridge that holds them steady as they move forward. Time did not heal everything, but it softened what once felt immovable, allowing reflection to do what reaction never could. After their conversation, both Keanu and Sandra returned to their separate rhythms with a new awareness, not of what had gone wrong, but of how easily even sincere intentions could drift into misunderstanding when left unspoken. The silence that once divided them no longer felt hostile, yet neither of them wanted to return to it unchanged. Something essential had been revealed, and with revelation comes responsibility. For Keanu, that responsibility lived in a growing recognition that restraint, while often wise, could become a shield that protected him at the expense of connection. He began to notice how often he had chosen quiet because it felt safer, because it allowed him to avoid the risk of saying the wrong thing. But life was teaching him something more demanding now. Avoiding harm was not the same as doing good. There were moments when presence mattered more than precision, when showing up imperfectly carried more kindness than remaining distant in the name of principle. This realization did not arrive as self-criticism, but as humility. Keanu reflected on how silence had served him throughout his life, how it had given him room to grieve privately, to listen deeply, to move through public noise without being consumed by it. Yet he could no longer ignore that habits formed for survival can outlive the situations that created them. What once protected him from chaos was now limiting his ability to participate fully in emotional connection. He began quietly and intentionally to practice something unfamiliar. He allowed himself to speak sooner, not impulsively, but before certainty had fully settled. He expressed appreciation more often. He clarified small misunderstandings instead of letting them dissolve into quiet. These were not dramatic changes, and no one announced them, but they were deliberate. Each moment of communication felt like a small act of trust, an acknowledgement that vulnerability did not weaken presence, it completed it. Sandra's transformation moved in a complementary direction. The clarity she had gained from waiting did not fade, it deepened. She recognized that her expectation for engagement, though valid, had been shaped by her own emotional language, her own history of confronting discomfort through dialogue. She began to see that she had interpreted silence through the lens of her fears, allowing uncertainty to fill gaps that communication had left open. This did not erase her pain, it reframed it. It made room for compassion where judgment might have lived. She practiced curiosity where assumption once rose instinctively. When silence appeared in other relationships, she no longer rushed to assign meaning to it. She learned to ask rather than conclude, to invite explanation rather than waiting for it to arrive on its own. In doing so, she felt something settle inside her, a steadiness that did not depend on how quickly others met her emotionally. Their next interactions carried none of the weight that once defined them. There was no need to revisit every detail of the past. Instead, there was ease, the kind that grows not from avoidance but from mutual respect restored. They spoke openly when they crossed paths, not to resolve old moments but to establish new ones. There was a noticeable absence of guardedness, a softness in the way their conversations unfolded. Silence still existed between them, but it no longer stood alone. It was accompanied by context, by gestures of presence, by small clarifications that kept quiet from becoming empty. They had not removed silence from their connection. They had given it a new language. What surprised both of them was how this internal shift began to influence the way they moved through the world beyond each other. Without announcing it, without shaping it into a narrative, their private growth started to shape public action. Keanu found himself more willing to engage when people around him hesitated to speak. He listened, as he always had, but he also responded more directly, understanding that listening without acknowledgement could sometimes feel like distance rather than care. He became more attentive to moments when a simple clarification could prevent unnecessary emotional labor for someone else. Sandra, in her own way, became more patient with ambiguity. She slowed the instinct to resolve immediately, choosing instead to observe, to invite dialogue rather than demand it. She noticed how often misunderstandings in everyday life were born not from malice, but from parallel assumptions moving past each other without ever intersecting. People around them sensed the shift before either of them named it. Conversations felt less cautious. There was an increased openness, a subtle willingness to acknowledge complexity rather than simplifying it for comfort. It became clear that their experience had not only altered how they related to each other, but how they embodied their values more broadly. In a world that rewarded certainty and speed, they were practicing something quieter but more demanding. Thoughtfulness paired with expression. Empathy paired with responsibility, silence paired with care. The moral weight of their journey revealed itself not through speeches or gestures, but through example. They demonstrated that justice in its most human form is not punishment or exposure, but accountability paired with compassion. By choosing humility over pride, conversation over withdrawal, and curiosity over assumption, they showed that power does not come from being right, but from being willing to grow. The silence that once caused pain had not been erased. It had been transformed. It was no longer a void. It had become a space intentionally shaped by presence. As Part 4 closes, the story stands not at an ending, but at a recalibration. The misunderstanding that once threatened to fracture connection has become the very experience that refined it. There is no declaration that everything is healed, because real growth does not resolve neatly. Instead, there is continuity, a sense that respect, kindness, and resilience are not destinations, but practices renewed daily through conscious choice. What once broke something fragile has now begun to build something resilient. And in that quiet rebuilding, both Keanu and Sandra are discovering that true strength does not live in silence alone or in speech alone, but in the wisdom to know when each must give way to the other. There is a difference between being known and being seen. To be known is to have facts remembered about you, stories associated with your name, a history that follows wherever you go. To be seen is rarer. It is to have someone recognize not just what you do, but how you carry what you feel. After everything that had passed between them, both Keanu and Sandra began to understand this distinction with a clarity that surprised them. The silence that once separated them had forced each into a deeper awareness of how often human connection fails not because of cruelty, but because of invisibility. And now, as they moved forward with renewed intention, they discovered that the most powerful change was not dramatic honesty or public reconciliation, but the steady, often unnoticed practice of making space for one another's emotional reality. Keanu found that his internal shift was reshaping the way he encountered people everywhere. He listened as he always had, but listening no longer ended in quiet acknowledgement. He allowed himself to respond more openly, to offer reassurance where he once assumed understanding would be inferred. He noticed how often people's stories carried unspoken questions, subtle invitations for presence rather than solutions. In those moments, he began to answer not with advice or silence, but with recognition. A sentence, a reflection, a confirmation that what had been shared had landed. These were small gestures, but he could feel their effect. Conversations felt less suspended. People left them more settled. He realized that by naming what he witnessed, he was not adding noise to the world, he was anchoring it, and in anchoring others, he found himself more grounded as well. Sandra experienced a parallel unfolding. The steadiness she had cultivated through waiting had given her a new relationship with vulnerability. She no longer felt compelled to fill quiet moments with certainty. Instead, she learned to inhabit them with curiosity. When something felt unclear, she began to ask, not to challenge, but to understand. When silence appeared, she did not immediately interpret it as absence. She allowed space for meaning to emerge before assigning it. This shift did not make her passive. It made her discerning. She discovered that strength did not require immediacy. It required presence. And presence, she learned, could be both expressive and receptive without contradiction. Their connection deepened in ways that were subtle but profound. When they spoke, there was less effort, less underlying tension, more room for complexity. They were not trying to repair the past. They were building something more honest for the present. They shared reflections rather than explanations. They acknowledged uncertainty rather than resolving it prematurely. Silence still existed between them, but it had become a shared space rather than a separating one. It was no longer where meaning disappeared. It was where meaning gathered. They had learned that silence, when paired with acknowledgement, could hold intimacy rather than distance. The emotional peak of this chapter did not arrive in a private moment between them, but through an experience that reflected their journey back to them from the outside. They both found themselves present at a gathering focused not on achievement, but on human resilience, where individuals spoke not about success, but about misunderstanding, reconciliation, and the long work of rebuilding trust. One speaker described how a single conversation, long delayed, had altered the course of a relationship not because it fixed everything, but because it restored visibility. They spoke about how being seen did not erase pain, but it softened it enough to be carried. As Sandra listened, she felt a familiar resonance. As Keanu listened, he felt recognition not only of the words, but of who he was becoming. In that moment, both understood something that no misunderstanding could have taught them otherwise, that the deepest kindness is not agreement. It is attention. It is the willingness to step into another person's emotional landscape without needing to control it. They realized that their conflict had not been a detour from their values. It had been an education in how those values must be lived. Compassion was not only about intention, it was about translation. About learning how to express care in a way that could actually be received. Justice, in its quietest form, was not exposure or defense. It was repair. It was the courage to return to a place of misunderstanding and rebuild it with humility rather than pride. As they continued forward, the ripple effects of this growth became more visible. Those around them felt more invited into conversation, more comfortable naming uncertainty, more willing to pause before concluding. Their example did not announce itself, but it shaped environments. It softened interactions. It modeled something increasingly rare: the patience to listen without disappearing, the courage to speak without overpowering. They were embodying a balance that neither of them had fully held before. And in doing so, they were discovering that the power to heal did not live in dramatic moments, but in consistent, conscious presence. As Part 5 closes, the story reaches its emotional height not through spectacle but through recognition. Keanu and Sandra are no longer standing on opposite sides of silence. They are standing within a shared understanding of it. They have not eliminated the quiet. They have transformed it. What once broke something fragile has become the space where something resilient is held. And in that space, they are learning that to be seen is not to be exposed. It is to be met. And being met, they now know, is one of the most powerful forms of human healing. Endings rarely arrive with certainty. They arrive with continuity, not with a sense that everything has been solved, but with the quieter understanding that something essential has shifted and will continue to shape what comes next. For Keanu and Sandra, what remained after the quiet was not a restored version of what had existed before, but something more grounded, something tempered by awareness rather than assumption. The misunderstanding that once threatened to divide them had not disappeared from memory, and it was not meant to. It had become part of their emotional architecture, a reminder of how easily even sincere values can misalign, and how intentionally they must be lived to remain humane. They no longer measured their connection by the absence of conflict, but by the presence of care. Silence still lived between them, but it no longer arrived alone. It carried acknowledgement. It carried context. It carried the unspoken understanding that quiet did not mean withdrawal and speech did not mean certainty. They had learned to let conversation and stillness move together, correcting one another, balancing one another. In this new rhythm, there was room for incompleteness without distance. There was space for uncertainty without threat. What had once felt fragile now felt flexible, and flexibility, they discovered, was a quieter form of strength. Keanu's growth continued to reveal itself not in declarations, but in daily decisions. He spoke more readily when something mattered. He clarified when he once would have assumed. He expressed appreciation before it could be mistaken for indifference. None of this made him louder. It made him more present. He remained thoughtful, restrained, and gentle, but his gentleness now included visibility. He understood that humility was not only about stepping back, but also about stepping forward when someone else's emotional reality called for response. In choosing to engage, he was not abandoning his nature. He was completing it. Sandra, in turn, carried forward a steadiness that had been forged in uncertainty. She no longer required immediate answers to feel secure in her worth. She had learned that her voice did not lose its value in the absence of response, and that patience, when chosen consciously, could be an expression of self-respect rather than endurance. She continued to speak honestly, but she also listened differently. She allowed silence to exist without filling it too quickly, trusting that meaning often emerges more clearly when it is not rushed. Her resilience had gained a new dimension, one that did not rely solely on engagement, but on discernment. What made their journey quietly powerful was not that it had restored something old, but that it had created something new, a way of relating rooted not in shared assumptions, but in shared responsibility. They had learned that connection is not sustained by intention alone, but by translation, by the ongoing effort to express care in ways that can be felt, not merely meant. This understanding did not remain private. It shaped how they moved through the world. Conversations around them grew more thoughtful. Disagreements softened before they hardened. People felt more seen, more invited into honesty without fear of spectacle. The impact of their growth traveled outward, not as influence but as atmosphere. In moments of reflection, both recognized that silence had not been their enemy. Unexamined silence had been. Silence used unconsciously had allowed distance to grow. Silence chosen intentionally, shaped by acknowledgement, had become something else entirely. It had become space. And space, when held with care, allows understanding to breathe. They no longer feared quiet. They respected it, but they also no longer surrendered responsibility to it. They understood now that true compassion does not hide behind restraint, and true resilience does not fear vulnerability. As their story settles into its close, there is no final scene meant to convince. There is only a truth offered gently. That relationships are not sustained by the absence of misunderstanding, but by the willingness to return to one another when misunderstanding occurs. That strength does not live exclusively in silence or in speech, but in the wisdom to know when each must give way to the other. That kindness is not only something we feel, but something we practice, again and again, in the ordinary moments where presence matters more than performance. In the end, what broke Sandra was not silence itself, but the absence of understanding. And what healed them both was not words alone, but the courage to use them with humility. The quiet between them now carries meaning rather than distance. It holds memory without resentment. It allows difference without disconnection. And in that balance, they found something deeper than agreement. They found mutual humanity. A shared recognition that being human is not about avoiding fracture, but about learning how to mend with grace. Their journey stands as a reminder not of celebrity, not of circumstance, but of something universal, that every person will one day stand on one side of a silence they did not choose, and that what defines us is not whether we retreat or react, but whether we are willing to step forward when quiet is no longer enough. Because in the end, the loudest expressions of care are rarely the most dramatic. They are the most deliberate. And it is in those deliberate moments that the human spirit reveals its quiet, enduring strength.